Hello, everybody. It's 3 o'clock here in Rome. While people are still joining, I'll just take a few minutes to start this webinar today. Still admitting people. We are a big crowd today, quite unexpected for this time of the year, but it's a sign of great interest in this topic and also in our speakers. So welcome to all. I'm still admitting people. So good morning, good afternoon. Yes, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this event. My name is Renata Mirulla. I am the facilitator of EvalForward, a community of practice on evaluation for food security, agriculture, and rural development. EvalForward is hosting today this event on how to review theories of change. So welcome to everyone again. And I'd like to say a few words, housekeeping matters. So this is an EvalForward Talks session. It's usually held as a session, as an informal way for members of this community of practice to share their challenges and their experiences with evaluation matters. Since we are a bigger group of participants, we will have to use the chat more than we usually do, and stay with the time with interventions. I just want to give a two words for our speakers. We have Anna Maria Augustyn. She will also facilitate this session. She was the one raising the topic on how to review theories of change on the EvalForward platform. The discussion is still open, by the way, so you're invited also to continue the conversation there online after the webinar. Anna Maria, she is an experienced international consultant. She's an expert in agriculture, environment research, technology, and innovation. And then we'll have also Tom Archibald, the main speaker of this event today, but I will leave the presentation to later. So I'll just hand over to Anna Maria now to take the floor and to open and introduce the topic of today's session. Thank you again, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depends on where you are located. So today we will have this interesting session on theories of change. And a few weeks ago, I launched a discussion that was supported by the EvalForward, and many people already contributed to this with interesting insights. I summarized the key points from this discussion here. And in terms of the theory of change reviews, one of the important aspects is to help to identify the rationale behind success or failure of interventions, projects, or programs. And it's quite necessary to move the project forward sometimes. So many organizations and evaluators are undertaking those kind of exercises. And once this theory of change review happens, we very often encounter the complexity. Every project, every intervention is set up in a certain complex environment. And the theory of change very often is able to spot those kind of elements in this complex reality around the project, which were not conceptualized at the beginning of the project. So when we do the theory of change, the review, sometimes we are able to detect those complexities that eventually hinder or support the project implementation. Then the discussion participants suggested also to make this approach to the TOC review more participatory, to involve as many responsible people as possible. And one more point that I want to highlight here is that once, for instance, the theory of change suggests changes in the intervention logic of the project, in the way how it is delivered, then they might be also challenging to implement because, for instance, you need to change indicators in the log frame, or maybe some additional people need to step into the process. Depends on the project, actually. So we had those initial findings from the discussion, and today we will have more on this topic, which will be presented by Tom Archibald. So I think you will be also able to contribute to the discussion with your experiences. And if you have any questions, meanwhile, please post them on the chat and we will try to approach it. So I will give the floor to Tom, and I will just briefly introduce Tom. He is a very distinguished speaker today. We are very happy that he accepted invitation to this session. Tom is a professor at the University Virginia Tech. As far as I understood, it's a land-grant university. And Tom is also a board member of the American Evaluation Society and is working practically with evaluation. I've seen some experiences that he had in Africa, which were quite interesting, and some really interesting publications on the topic. And Tom is also involved in the reviews of scientific works in different journals. So I give the floor to Tom now.
Great, thank you so much, Anna Maria, and thank you, Renata and EvalForward for having me here. Just to double check, can you see my first slide okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. So yes, I'm joining you today from the lands traditionally cared for by the Tutelo and Monacan people in a place currently called Blacksburg, Virginia in the US. And it's a real honor to be here with you today. I just want to share for about 15 minutes. I'll try to keep myself to that so that we have plenty of time for exchanging and discussing, because we know that everyone here probably has some experience and expertise with this topic, which is reviewing theories of change. So very briefly, I'll just touch on theory of change basics. It's not the point of our time together today, but just in case some people joining are a bit newer to the topic, and I really do encourage you to check out the forum on the EvalForward site, because the resources and insights that others have already shared are really, really rich. And then spend most of our time talking about the why and the how of reviewing theory of change diagrams and theories of change, and then just wrap up with some of the challenges faced and some of the results, the benefits of doing this type of work before we move into the discussion. So one great resource created by Harriet Matzeret for UNEP is a nice video when here just showing that theories of change are essentially a way to demonstrate the objectives and the ways in which an institution or an organization or a program's work is trying to feed towards addressing the challenges to achieve results and impacts. This is one type of image of a theory of change showing how the activities and outputs then lead out through the sphere of influence to the sphere of interest. And at the bottom, the stakeholder engagement throughout. This is going to be an important point throughout our conversation today. Also, you might notice that this image looks a little bit like what could be called a logic model or a results chain. And Silva Ferretti on the forum shared that, there's a spectrum between log frames and logic models and more complexity aware or complexity sensitive theory of change. And here's an example shared by Silva that is much, much more complex. So to sum up this quick introduction of the basics, I would say theory of changes are greater than and better than logic models or log frames, etc. Because although there's many, many definitions of theory of change, everyone agrees that it's similar in function, but adds a few layers of detail, layers of complexity as over and above those more linear types of models of program theory or program intervention. They can be graphically represented using a variety of ways, or also, and often are represented through narrative text as well. And they vary in their level of complexity and detail. So there's a broad spectrum of what these might look like. So again, this is not the primary focus of the discussion. We could have a whole separate conversation just about what is a theory of change. Again, check out the forum for some great resources on that. So first of all, before talking about how to review a theory of change, it's important to establish why it's important. A number of years ago, actually on an EvalTalk post, the listserv of the American Evaluation Association, Eric Gregg had a nice post where he suggested that many theories of change perhaps ought better to be called conjectures of change, because there was very little theory in the theories of change. There was a lot of wishful thinking. And this is true, probably in your experience. And Stein and Walters, around the same time, wrote a couple of nice summary papers, really emphasizing how good theories of change are very explicit about assumptions, evidence, and social theory. So this is a way to hedge against just having a conjecture of change, is when you really work hard to identify the assumptions, think about what evidence you have, what evidence you need, and then also bring in social theories from sociology, from behavior change, from various different disciplines that sometimes we neglect in monitoring and evaluation, but which have, important bearing on how we understand how people work in the world as they try to affect change. Very often, the theory of change was created by just a few people in an isolated context. So it's probably oftentimes, someone is writing a project document, a proposal, they're sitting in their office alone, perhaps in the so-called global north, when the program or project is supposed to be implemented in the so-called global south. And that's problematic because it's very, very hard to imagine that that theory of change will be realistic. Oftentimes, and some people mentioned this in the forum, they're created at the outset of the project, and then never again are we to hear from or see that theory of change. It's filed away in a desk drawer and never looked at again. And then often it's also seen to be static. So one contributor to the discussion mentioned that they actually refer to them as theories of flux rather than theories of change, just to emphasize that complex dynamic nature of the work that all of us are engaged with. One key point I want you to take away from this brief presentation is the importance of assumptions. And I'm going to come back to that in just a few moments in terms of the how. So just to wrap up, why review them? It's because it allows us to identify and then problematize or question the assumptions that are inherent in our program design, to identify evidence gaps, which is then extremely important for focusing our monitoring, evaluation, and learning approaches as the project unfolds, to establish a realer, deeper type of validity. So even if a theory of change is based on some scientific theories, as I mentioned earlier, unless it's ground truth with the people who actually know about what's going on, the theory of change is probably lacking in validity. I have found in my own practice, and a lot of the literature corroborates this, that it is a very concrete and explicit way to foreground voice, participation, and collaboration in program design and monitoring, evaluation, and learning, which has both instrumental reasons, getting back to that validity piece, it just makes the work better. And then there's also ethical reasons. It's just the right thing to do to avoid a colonizing and imperialistic approach to so-called development work in agriculture and other domains as well. And for me, theory of change review is a way to really operationalize praxis, which has many definitions, but in one sense, you could just understand praxis as being the coming together of theory and practice. And ultimately, the end goal is to try to achieve better results. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, and it's maybe easier said than done, but it's also within reach. It's quite doable. And one thing, I don't have this written out, but one major point that I want to emphasize is that people get this just naturally and intrinsically. When you create the conditions to do a collaborative review of a theory of change, no matter what someone's job is, or title, or language, or socioeconomic status, or what have you, they get it and they engage with it. So to really make it work, in my experience, you need to get buy-in from multiple levels of the system. So perhaps if it's an organization based in a particular country, maybe with a headquarters elsewhere, you need to get the headquarters buy-in, you need to get the country leadership, You need to get the M&E staff, the program staff, and perhaps most importantly, get the genuine participation of the people involved in implementing the program and perhaps even participating in the program. You can do this online, but it's not ideal. You really should be in a room together, spending time together. A number of days is ideal, actually. And then there is a question about scope and scale, depending on the size of your group, whether you're focused on one overreaching sort of meta theory of change, or whether there's some rationale to break the initiative down into different focal areas and have groups of 3 or 4 people developing a theory of change for each one. Then where it really happens is when you have people generally with a sticky wall, or paper on the wall, sticky notes. We've facilitated this in many different ways, but it has to be hands-on and engaging with. It's basically a facilitated brainstorming session. And on this point, I would say, so we are here today to talk about reviewing theories of change, but I think the best way to review a theory of change is actually to have people create their own version of it first without looking at the pre-established one, and then later you can compare it. So that's actually kind of a radical approach to reviewing, because it's starting anew and then comparing. And then there's a sort of feedback loop between evaluative thinking and TOC review. They both reinforce each other as a way of really embedding reflective practice into the work that we do. So what is evaluative thinking? I don't have time to go into great detail on it, but this is a concept that's really, really central to the whole field of evaluation. And it's something that folks like Michael Patton and Wind and Carden, who at the time were with the IDRC in Canada, have talked about for many, many years. And essentially, it's a type of reflective practice. It's a way to question, reflect, learn, and modify to do adaptive development. With my colleagues, Jane Buckley, Monica Hargraves, and Bill Trosham, we've sort of elucidated this definition and then have tweaked it over the years. But you'll notice that it's a type of, it's somewhat related to critical thinking. It has to do with inquisitiveness, believing that evidence has value. And the very first subpoint there is identifying assumptions. And that's where we came to integrate evaluative thinking with the theory of change review process, because it's an extremely powerful way of identifying assumptions and then improving theory of changes and ultimately improving programs as a result. In the forum, I shared this paper, so it's available there as well. And this kind of sums up a lot of the work that I've done around applying evaluative thinking to theory of change review, with generous support from Catholic Relief Services, Guy Chirac, along with my colleague Jane Buckley and Natalie Cook, who's a colleague at Virginia Tech. And in this work, we did the work of going to the wall. So here you see a few CRS colleagues from both Ethiopia and Zambia, engaging in collaborative creation of theory of change diagrams, which then they could compare to the existing ones that were in the project document, which incidentally raised one of the challenges where these frontline workers who are really knowledgeable about the program, they did this work, they identified problematic assumptions, and then they said, but what can we do? Because the existing theory of change is already what the funder has agreed to. In this case, the funder was USAID. And the country director said, well, we are sure that the funder would rather us adapt and change to improve our intervention based on this theory of change review process, rather than just stay the course and risk not having the positive impacts on society that we hope to have. So it's a whole process of creating the model and then going through a facilitated step of identifying key assumptions, key outcomes, thinking about what different stakeholders would think about the different outcomes. Some folks in the forum had shared a few sort of resources with lists of questions. These are the lists of questions that we shared in that article, which is available in the forum as well. And they're just reflective questions for how to collaboratively review a theory of change, taking into consideration stakeholder perspectives, common threads, key assumptions that may have been missed. Again, we don't have time to go into great detail about assumptions, but I just wanted to share Stephen Brookfield, as well as Apollo Nwake and others have written quite a bit about identifying assumptions. And it's helpful to just think of 3 different types of assumptions. There are more, and it's not mutually exclusive, but it's kind of a good heuristic device when you're identifying a TOC, identifying the assumptions within a TOC. There's causal assumptions. So anytime there's an arrow between 2 boxes or bubbles, that's making an if-then type of assumption. Then there are prescriptive assumptions, which have to do with what ought to be happening. So they have a slightly normative sense. And then the hardest assumptions to identify are those paradigmatic or foundational assumptions that sort of undergird all of the ways that an organization functions. And here's sort of in an overly simplified fashion where those assumptions show up in a theory of change type diagram, of course. Again, I mentioned Apollo's work. He has at least 2 books on working with assumptions in especially international development evaluation. So I recommend his work as well. Finally, coming back to that paper and how we got that title of Assumptions, Conjectures, and Other Miracles, you've probably seen this cartoon on the left where, you know, the middle of the equation is a miracle. A lot of our theory of changes are like that. You know, we know what the activities are, we know what the outcomes or impacts are, but the middle is a bit fuzzy. So one of our participants in Zambia actually used this miracle metaphor as a way of providing feedback to one of his peers on their theory of change during this review process. So to sum up, sort of where does this leave us? This is from another great resource that was shared in the EvalForward forum. This is in particular about evaluating research, but it applies to evaluating development programs as well. Just some of the challenges that you can encounter. People say they don't have time to do this. People have different paradigmatic approaches to either getting right down into the details or thinking at a higher, more abstract level. So that's hard to facilitate, but necessary. Engaging with discomfort. Guy Chirac always talked about the need for psychological safety, because when you start critiquing the assumptions that are underlying your employer's theory of change, it can feel risky. You know, is your boss going to accept that you're criticizing the entire modus operandi of this particular project? So those are true challenges, but there are ways to overcome them. So this was actually shared by my colleague Hayat Asghar in the EvalForward forum from USAID Jordan training, and they actually drew on the same work I've just been sharing from Guy Chirac and Catholic Relief Services, and they shared how they overcame some of these challenges to actually lead to more productive work processes, more substantive reporting, and ultimately better programs. And you'll see on the bottom, I just summarized that when you review a theory of change, it can lead to at least 2 things fundamentally, either improving the model because maybe the theory of change had errors in it, or making actually adaptive changes to the program. So just to conclude, this is a very salient topic. It links very much to USAID's collaborating, learning, and adapting, and the whole AdaptDev sort of community that's been going on for a few years. It's linked to a lot of cutting edge areas in M&E, such as Steve Powell's work on causal mapping, the qualitative impact pathways work, outcome harvesting, the late great John Main's work on contribution analysis that's being continued by folks like Sebastian Lemire and others. And just on a personal note, I was reflecting that the first time anyone ever gave me money to do anything in evaluation wasn't even to do evaluation, it was just to help them review their TOC. And that was back in 2008. So it's kind of fun to still be talking about this today. And in some, you know, across all the different work I've done, it's some of the stuff that has motivated and inspired me the most, largely because people whose voices have never been respected or heard in their professional careers, when you get them in a room and have them collaboratively reviewing a TOC, more than the content, they feel valued and heard and respected. And for me, that's the type of work I want to be doing. So to wrap up, I think evaluative thinking applied to theory of change diagrams is a way to really emphasize praxis, to demystify theory, make it seem more understandable, and also remystify practice, to really recapture that je ne sais quoi, that sort of mysterious expertise that all practitioners have as they do agricultural development work. So with that, I thank you. Sorry, I went a little bit over, but we still have plenty of time for discussion. We'll share these slides as well. This link can take you to a folder full. If you're interested in learning more about evaluative thinking and as it applies to TOC, you can go to this link and get some free resources there. So we'll be able to share this on the forum as well and with everyone who's registered. So thanks so much.
Thanks to Tom. It was a very interesting presentation, very rich with a lot of insights. And I think we will come back with the questions to Tom. If you have any questions, please post them in the chat. And meanwhile, we have some questions to you, a short poll that Renata prepared. So we would like to ask you a few things. First question is, have you been involved in revisions of theories of change or intervention logic? Because for the EU project, sometimes it's called intervention logic. You may have heard this term. So let's see what are the results. As far as I can see, majority has been involved already. Right. Okay.
I'll show the results, Anna.
Yeah,
I see people are still voting.
Okay, we
but
give a little more time.
I'll give a couple of seconds.
Okay, great.
Okay, I'll end the poll so we can all see them.
Okay, we can close the poll. So as we can see, quite a lot of people, 71% has been already experienced with theory of change review. Some 25% were not experienced, and very few are not sure. Okay. Okay, Renata, maybe the next question. So the next question is, how useful did you find the theory of change or intervention logic reviews? Okay, a few more people want to contribute. Great. So 45% consider this as useful and 29% as very useful. And then the other ones maybe less sure about it or maybe don't have experience with it. But in general, I think we can say that this practice is useful for the projects. And okay. So I think this is the last question, as far as I remember. Did the review lead to changing indicators or targets of the project or program? Okay. Okay, as we can see, majority of people who experience this thing in practice, they consider that it was progressing in changing the indicators and targets of the program or project. And some people, 23%, are not experienced with it. Okay, thank you for your contributions. I think we will be soon opening the discussion where you can also share your experiences. In case you would like to speak, please notify us with a hand. You can find this button below in your dashboards, in the reactions. So please let us know if you would like to speak. So we have 2 questions for the discussion with you. But if you have also questions to Tom or myself, please ask them in the chat. And our questions to you are the following. What were your challenges in reviewing theory of change, and how did you address them? And the second question is, who did you engage in the theory of change revision? So what kind of stakeholders? Okay, I see that the participant who raised hand is, okay. I cannot unlock you, but I can see there's one person who raised Eddie. Okay, Eddie Marinda, Nicole Bauman. Okay, we start with Eddie. Eddie, you can briefly introduce yourself and tell us the story.
Okay, no, thank you. I hope you can hear me. I'm Ed Marinda. I'm a research director at the Human Sciences Research Council Impact Center. I suppose, I mean, my experience mostly in terms of theory of change is more in terms of, you know, your causal models in epidemiology and health. One of the interesting things is that you're supposed to use theory of change as a measurement model, right? Because the idea is to actually see what's the most impactful intervention, or amongst all the interventions that you're doing and other possible causal links, what contributes most to change. And if we don't use that sort of causal model, in a sense, we may end up not necessarily measuring the most important things that actually result in impact. So I can give an example, for instance, now where we are looking at COVID vaccination in South Africa. When vaccines became available, a lot of uptake, and then we plateaued around the 50% mark. The question is, people who are amenable to vaccinations, they took it up. Now we are actually sort of stuck, and most of the issues that inform vaccination really are sort of personal cultural issues, which we never deal with. So if one looks at a theory of change model without necessarily looking at those aspects, we may say vaccination is not working, people are not taking it up, but there is need, for understanding all the processes that can possibly lead to impact. So for me, I mean, I think there's another layer. As I said, my experience is actually in the public health, although I've applied it in other sort of fields, where it's important to be able to use the theory in terms of the science, to be able to sort of move towards the impact. Thank you.
And Anna Maria, you're on mute if you're talking there, sorry.
Oh, sorry, I am muted. Okay, so I wanted to now give the floor to Nicole and thank Eddie for the contribution.
Kolomowski from Turtle Island. I'm Nikki Bowman. And go figure, Dr. Archibald has given me yet another thing to think about. Sorry, I'm out on my walk in the countryside here. So we braid hair. And I'm thinking about these 3 strands that I never put together before of evaluative thinking, underlying assumption, and theory of change. And as an Indigenous person, I'm Mohican and Lenape, trying to apply Indigenous theory and methods to this wild world of evaluation. I'm sitting here going, evaluative thinking even has an assumption, because the way we think Lenape or think Mohican is very different than English thinking, even from the linguistic way of words, or the way we do concepts or talk about theories of change, knowing, being, doing, everything. And so I don't know how to decolonize evaluative thinking, because the minute you switch it into English, it's colonized. So I'm grappling with that. But I also wonder, as somebody who has to write a lot about indigenous, pre-contact to early contact to post-contact and try to break it down for non-indigenous folks. I'm curious as to how our presenters have worked with non-English speaking and non-English thinking folks around theory of change, underlying assumptions, because that foundational assumption, I'm still learning about our foundational assumptions, and foundational assumptions, theory of change and evaluative thinking. How do you, I don't know if the right word is how do you learn that, but how do you sort of balance that out to make sure that it's valid, trustworthy, ethical, culturally specific, as well as culturally responsive? That's just as, I don't know, Tom, I'm going to be thinking about this for a while, and I'm circling back for sure. But thank you for this very stimulating talk this morning. Geez, I didn't want to think this hard, but here I am.
Thank you, Nicole, for your very interesting insights. And I think these questions are really valid. I'm not a native speaker myself, so I sometimes also struggle to translate the terms, the specific evaluation terms into my native language. And now I will give the floor to Dr. Apur Ponga. I hope I pronounce it well, but please introduce yourself briefly.
And Anna Maria, before war goes, can I
just
quickly respond to Nikki's excellent comments? Thank you, Nikki.
Okay.
And our colleague Timothy O'Connor has put in the chat as well as along a similar line, working with Aboriginal organizations and framing it in terms of practice wisdom, which I also really like. And in the folder that I shared, there is, from our new directions for evaluation, a chapter by Nan Wapanana and Kate McKeag on evaluative thinking through an Indigenous Artorian framing. And so that's the start, but it really comes down to, well, so it starts with linguistic translations. For instance, the only other language I know is French, and translating the word assumptions into French is actually not that easy. You could say hypothèse, you could say préjugé, it's not quite right. And then in the local language in Eastern Zambia, where I was doing that workshop, they had no problem translating it into the language there linguistically. But then when you start, like Nikki was getting at, identifying assumptions, especially the paradigmatic assumptions. I mean, if a program which is for and by Indigenous or First Nations people is founded on a fundamentally different ontology, so basically philosophy of reality, then applying a framework that's rooted in a Euro-Western ontology will never be quite commensurate, regardless of how much you review the theory of change. And I was talking about this just yesterday with some colleagues too, with all due respect to our funding agencies who want us to do this, where are the boundaries of what assumptions we can question? So, if there's so much work in development now, which is market-driven. Well, market-driven development is fundamentally rooted in capitalism and to some extent neo-imperialism. So what if we want to question that assumption? Is that within bounds or out of bounds? So similar to sort of what Nikki was getting at. It's a new sort of Euro-American word for an age-old process, which is identifying and questioning assumptions about one's worldview, which, to be frank, a lot of native epistemologies, indigenous epistemologies, do much more naturally than a lot of Euro-American epistemologies, where we've been taught reductionistic Cartesian thinking that separates fact from value, head from heart, etc. So it's sort of much more natural amongst, not to be sort of like overly simplistic with it, but it's a natural way of thinking amongst a lot of the groups around the world that is unfortunately been weeded out of the sort of linear, technocratic, rationalistic Euro-American approach to doing so-called development. But now over to Dr. Ponge.
Yes, you can speak now. Sorry for keeping you longer, but please.
Okay, thank you so much, Thomas, for that wonderful presentation. It's a great pleasure listening to you. Right. I'm not sharing my experience on how I have conducted a theory of change, a review of theory of change, but was just impressed with your illustration of Eric Craig when he talks of theory of change as merely conjecture of change. And what came to my mind was what you were taught in philosophy about Karl Popper on his evolution of scientific knowledge. And what I try to derive from Karl Popper's evolution of scientific knowledge with this conjecture of change by Eric Craig is that, there are two things. One, that evaluation is a scientific approach to establish evidence of what worked, where, when, and for whom. And I think this is closely linked to what you had illustrated in one of your publications on the belief in the value of evidence. But then again, I know Nikki will ask me about evaluation being a scientific approach, and she will want to know whether the indigenous ways are not authentic ways of establishing evidence. Then the second element I derive from Karl Popper is that evaluation is not static, as development context is also dynamic. And in this case, I'm trying to draw a situation where, for example, an intervention was implemented without a specific theory of change at design stage. And then when you come in as an evaluator, you are told to reconstruct the theory of change. So what comes to my mind here is to just go to the wishful thinking of the people or the agency that was initiating an intervention. What were their thinkings about how the change they want to bring would come about? Thank you.
Thanks very much for your contribution, Avor. And I don't see more hands raised. Oh, maybe Daniel, you're raising hand. I can see the video. Please introduce yourself and let us know your experience.
Okay, no, thank you. So my name is Daniel Tyseth. I'm from the UK and I work for myself at the moment. But I spent 20 years living in different African and Asian countries and have stuck to M&E throughout my career. And in all honesty, I'm more interested in the monitoring and learning than evaluation in terms of systems and processes and so on. I wanted to say, first of all, thanks a lot for the great presentation. I thought that the structure of the review of the theory of change was about the why and the how, but also who's doing it. Because I think it's really important, specifically, especially in terms of ownership and engagement in the process. If on the one hand, you have a donor saying this has to happen, and it's in the theory, it's in the terms of reference, that's one thing. But then it's quite another for a senior management group to say, we found out through our monitoring and learning that things are going a bit haywire, and can we please gather and do some workshopping and thoughtful analysis and bring all your critical faculties with you, because we need to change. I think they're two very, very different scenarios. So that's the first thing I kind of wanted to say. But the other point was on the issue of the, sometimes people make too black and white a difference between logical frameworks and theories of change. I say that for two reasons, because the methodology for developing a theory of change and the methodology for developing a logical framework, if done properly, should actually be the same. In other words, if you go back to the 1980s and the work that GTZ did with Robert Chambers on how to develop a participatory approach to develop a log frame, I haven't seen a better method. Indeed, some people are quite shy and indeed shy away from what was the methodology for developing the theory of change? Who was involved? Whose theory is this? So it relates to many of the power dynamics you're talking about decolonization, not just localization, but decolonization of especially development aid, because many stories from the civil service structures, whether they're USAID or DFID or FCDO or the bank. These people are all civil servants, and they start the story. They come up with the need. So to challenge critical assumptions about what's the rationale of the entire program, you know, the kind of neoliberal Western thing. Don't tell me anyone's had any experience of doing an evaluation midterm or even at the end, where the donor on receiving the messages kind of says, oh, okay, we'll stop the program or abolish the whole market systems development approach, you know. So there's a dose of realism. I'm not saying it shouldn't come with the conversation and you shouldn't raise it, but I think a lot of this depends on the willingness being presented with the evidence of those to accept it and to work forward. So I think those for me are critical things, because I think, to be fair to the log frame, central to the log frame, assumptions matter more than the blooming indicators. You know, if you want to learn, you don't learn by saying we've delivered 50,000 jobs in 2 districts. What are you going to learn from that beyond you have or you haven't by a certain degree? So I think it's really important that rather than throwing measuring sticks at indicators in a log frame, that the one offer that it's presentational rather than substantive is the theory of change makes those assumptions really explicit. And I really like the typology of the 3, because a lot of the times we get the action theory wrong. In other words, the stimuli that's being delivered in these strange, messy, unpredictable environments, and making sure, because if you measure those assumptions behind those, you're going to be in time. If you just measure the indicators, you're too late, as David Snowden tells us very, very clearly. So yeah, but anyway, I just wanted to pitch in and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think these were very important points, and I guess a lot of development workers are also concerned about it, knowing the chamber's contribution whose reality counts. I also reflect upon it quite often, and I'm wondering how far we are in the projectified world, because we have this development interventions very much focused around the project programs or certain management tools that we are using to make change, and evaluation is naturally adapted to them. On the other hand, I've seen emergent approaches that are alternative to theory of change and can be also practiced alongside these traditional approaches. Something like participatory impact pathway analysis, outcome harvesting, social network analysis. So those approaches are increasingly taken up by evaluators, but I think sometimes the commissioners of evaluation are missing the point that they can be actually useful and how they can help to improve the delivery. So maybe we should have more of this. Okay, so maybe—
Can I just say quickly, yeah, I completely agree, but the problem is that a lot of these methods come from researchers and academics, and they're wonderful, but to apply them in the real world, the world I've just described, is fine. You know, don't have a log. I mean, Rick Davis came up with measuring no indicators. So there's nothing kind of wonderfully revealing about outcome harvesting in that respect. But I do think that it's about adapting them to the real world, whether it's an organization or program. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you just get the feeling that these are research methodologies rather than actually being practically adapted sometimes to many of the circumstances. You just need to look at who wrote them.
Yes, thank you, Daniel.
Thanks.
And I think we will now ask a few questions that were posted on the chat. Especially, I hope Tom will be able to give us some insights. So one of the questions is, Tom, should the same players who develop the theory of change be the ones with review, or it should be others involved as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it should be others. Because they're seeing it with fresh eyes, and they probably have better grounded reality understanding than the people who created it. And so it could be an iterative process where, as I said, perhaps one of the best ways to revise the theory of change is to create a new one and then compare. And so in terms of the who is in the room, and I love that so many people are emphasizing the who, Daniel and others, that's really, really important. But I would say what really helps improve the theory of change is to have a new group of people who unfortunately were not invited in the initial creation to create their own, and then you can compare.
Mm-hmm. So some kind of out of the box thinking and experience, right?
Yes.
Okay, other questions?
I noticed there were a few questions about, you know, what happens when the more senior leadership doesn't see the value of this. And I think that is a very, very good question. And I would say one potential strategy could be to, you know, to meet them where they are. What's the value proposition for them? So whereas with the so-called frontline staff, the value proposition is very clear. It's, you know, you've been in this work for 20 years and no one has ever asked you what you thought was going on. And today we're doing that. And that people resonate, that resonates with people. With the senior leadership, you could say, you know, you make a business case, perhaps, you know, you're investing X dollars on this activity. This monitoring report suggests that it's having absolutely zero effect. Wouldn't you like to spend an afternoon trying to recalibrate so that you can use your limited resources more wisely and ensure that you meet your accountability requirements with the funder or the government? So it's sort of pitching the case differently based on the different audience, and, you know, perhaps senior leadership, the sort of business management argument might click with them a little bit more, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
And I will just give a shout out to Catholic Relief Services, especially in Zambia, but elsewhere. Their senior leadership just intuitively got it from the outset, and even participated in a workshop, as well as supported us to do longer workshops with folks out in the field. But not every organization is like that, and certainly not every organization is willing to drastically change if the activity indicates that it's completely off the rails. Or that's founded on a fundamentally flawed paradigm, or that the problem identification, as Daniel mentioned, was wrong from the very outset. There are a few that can do that I've seen a few instances of, but it's very rare.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Tom. And I was wondering if you've seen also this kind of situation that the theory of change review pointed needs to change the underlying ways how an organization functions, not just the project or program, but the functioning of an organization.
I've seen organizations get close to doing that. It's a few foundations that we've worked with have done that. Not all the way, but they've started asking questions like, what if we've been defining good grant making wrong all along? Like after evaluative thinking theory of change workshop. So they're at least questioning their fundamental modus operandi. Whether that leads to, you know, whole-scale institutional restructuring or changing of their mission statement, I haven't actually seen it go quite that far yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so in my experience, I've seen something which was about public procurement, which was hindering the project implementation. So I think it might happen in many institutions that the public procurement is creating issues for the project delivery. Okay, maybe next question. What critical evidence do we need to initiate the theory of change review?
Well, I think in the way, this participatory collaborative way that we're talking about, the most crucial evidence is the lived experience of the people in the room who weren't in the room before. So a positivist could call that, you know, anecdotal. And by the way, I love that Dr. Ponge evoked Popper, because that, even, you know, as a post-positivist, it's very, very, very important. If you hear anyone in your world say, we proved this, or, you know, even this causes this, I would question them about their epistemology, because Popper would reject that. You can't prove anything in social science. You can just get closer to what's probably accurate. But evidence from, you know, a 70-year-old man who's been volunteering with the program for 30 years, who knows why farmers are not implementing conservation agriculture practices other than in the first 2 rows of their field. He knows that, And so getting back to Chambers, whose reality counts, that reality counts as evidence. But then, and actually Marta Herto in Canada has done some really good writing on using intuition in evaluation. And intuition in and of itself is not adequate for evaluation because it's neither systematic nor, you know, I think maybe objectivity is a myth, but objectivity is something. I mean, you want verifiable evidence. Even Popper wanted that. So you don't just write an evaluation report based on intuition. That would not be evaluation. But you use your practical wisdom and your reservoir of past experience to identify areas that require further evidence gathering, and then you can shine that evidentiary light towards those areas. So that's where evaluative thinking applied to theory of change models can, the most critical evidence is the lived experience of the people who are implementing or experiencing the program. And then using their intuition and their somewhat systematic qualitative experience, you can then sort of roll that up into more systematic approaches to gathering evidence. That's what I would say to that.
Thanks, Tom. I see that Nicole is raising hand. Please, Nicole, share your thoughts with us.
Well, okay, again, Tom, more thinking. I have to go revisit Marta's article, but I will offer from an Indigenous Anishinaabe specific perspective. There are 7 directions and teachings in those directions. I know Ubuntu also has sky and earth teachings. Sorry, our neighbor kid does Papa Wheelies along the driveway here. Anyways, or the frontage road. Anyways, that I would argue from oral history and the way we do things that intuition voice is your inside, is your inner voice. So north, south, east, west teachings, earth teachings, sky teachings, and the 7th direction is inside. And so that's something, another thing that I'm going to have to write down and sort of unpack, because I think I think that feeds into the myth of objectivity. You know, I think from a cognitive theory standpoint, we all come in with stuff. And I think we suppress, I think Western academia poo-poos that inner voice, that inner wisdom that you're carried in your DNA and your praxis, your lived experience. That's where that voice comes from. And so I would argue that from Anishinaabe teachings of the 7 directions, that inner voice is relevant both to praxis and to theory of change. And I got to read Marta's stuff again. And thank you for sharing all of our lovely colleagues and their good writing. I really appreciate that revisit. Thank you for allowing me to add.
Thank you, Nikki. Great points.
Thanks a lot. We are actually very close to 4 p.m. my time. I don't know what is the time in your location, but we already ran out of time for our session. So I would like to thank you for participation. And actually, we still have this discussion open. And meanwhile, we have a short feedback poll. If you would like to contribute, you are welcome. And if you still have any thoughts concerning the theory of change reviews, remember that the EvalForward has a discussion open on this topic. And we will be summarizing it soon with some additional points. If you have any materials, references, please send them to us because we are very interested to know about your insights. So thanks very much. Maybe a few closing words by Tom and Renata.
Well, I'll jump in. First of all, thank you all for being here today and for your engagement and for your positive feedback and wonderful insights in the chat. Let's keep the conversation going in the forum. And I just wish we had more time to sit together and talk about these important topics. So I'm just very grateful to you, and I'm grateful to EvalForward for making this space. So thank you.
So my turn. Thank you both of you, Tom and Anna, for supporting this really rich conversation and the online discussion and this follow-up. It is great. So I invite you, some of you may already be members of EvalForward, but otherwise I invite you to join this community of practice and to reach out. So, and I hope we'll have more opportunities, surely have more opportunities to continue this discussion. So thank you all. And as I said in the chat, we will follow up with all the registered participants and share the recording and the presentations from this meeting. But thanks so much. It was very interesting and insightful. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Emil.